yesterday and today, and I wanted to say that how impressed I am with a great range of research that folks here are doing, and I've really enjoyed visiting with several of you today, and I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to talk about stress and depression in principally adult female Somalis monkeys that you see here. And almost all the research that I'm going to talk about has been done at the Primates Center at Wake Forest University. And so, in people, stress and depression are two different things. We all get that they are not the same thing, but they have many characteristics in common. They promote each other. They both adversely affect social relationships and quality of life and health. They both increase risk of many other diseases, but they're not the same construct of human beings. And I've become just more and more fascinated with that as I've studied our monkeys and how, and in similarities and the differences, and what understanding those similarities and differences might do to help us understand human health. So, just a couple real brief definitions. The one I'm working with for the purposes of this talk, stress is the experience, and that could be physical, emotional, or mental responses of an individual when their resources, and those resources, of course, can be also varied. Their strengths, coping mechanisms, social supports, and so on. Anyway, those resources are not adequate to meet the demands of the environment. And depression, when I'm talking about depression, I'm meaning the way it's, when I'm talking about human depression, the way we diagnose it in people. And I've taken these, this is out of DSM-4, I've sort of reorganized the characteristics of depression into three major categories: one affect, one having to do with energy and activity, and one having to do with cognitive changes that occur. And I think the most important part about the diagnosis of depression, to me at least, is that you have to have 5 or more of these symptoms during a 2-week period, and they have to represent a change from previous functioning. But that means that actually you can have 2 people diagnosed, have the same diagnosis, and they can have no symptom overlap. And that is one of the many challenges when we're studying depression, because it is, in fact, so heterogeneous. So what I'm going to try to do today, and you're such an eclectic group that I probably am going to try to cover too much territory, because I felt like I needed to put in something for everyone. But if I do go and going too quickly, feel free to stop me and ask questions and slow me down. What I'd like to be able to do is talk a little bit about that relationship between stress and depression, talk about our monkey model of stress-related depression that we've studied for several years now, and then wind up comparing and contrasting stressed monkeys versus depressed monkeys, and ask the question of where they're similar and where they're different. I think it's important to understand the relationship between stress and depression for a variety of reasons, but of course, a big one is because depression is, bouts of depression are often precipitated by stressful events. That's more true about first depressions and becomes less and less true with subsequent depressions. It's also the case that not all stresses result in depression, so it's a loose relationship. And the characteristics that are that do connect the two are interesting. And if we could understand them better, why some individuals are resilient and some are susceptible, it might lead us in the direction of new therapies. And we need new therapies because right now, maybe we can treat effectively perhaps 1 in 4 depressed people, and depression is common. It's 20% of women will have a significant depression in their lifetime, 10% in men. So this is a common disorder. Factors that affect the stress-depression relationship, obviously the nature of the stressor. And we've had interesting discussions this morning because they're probably very also the resiliency of the stressed individual, and that gets really complicated. Depression is heritable, and therefore we understand that there are genetic factors that contribute to resiliency and susceptibility, although we don't understand all of what those are. Since the environment can precipitate depression, then that means gene-environment interactions are going to be really important. And of course, there's this growing literature on the potential for genetic modifications due to early exposures to environmental perturbations that likely contribute to this resiliency and susceptibility. It's tough to study stress-depression relationships in people for lots of reasons, but two primary ones certainly are that the stress can be temporally remote from the depression. And so they may, if they're separate in time, it gets really difficult to study the relationship between the two. And the other is this difficulty of early experience modifying later stress later stress responses. So that makes it tough in people. We should be able to use animal models to address these two constructs, and they certainly have been used extensively as an alternative to clinical studies. And but probably with varying degrees of success. I think there's a lot of feeling out there now that we need to go looking for new animal models to help us address sort of novel aspects of both stress responsivity and depression that haven't been addressed well with our current models. When we do animal model evaluation, and some of you mostly study people, a lot of you do animal model research, I know. I'll just remind you that when we're thinking about the validity of an animal model, a model can be valid from in a variety of ways. It can have construct validity, meaning the causes of the pathology in the animal model are the same causes of the pathology you're trying to model in people, etiology. It can have predictive validity, and in the case of depression, many of the models, that was the hallmark, is predictive validity. That is, they're used a lot in testing pharmacotherapeutics, particularly rodent models, because in order to predict efficacy in human beings. Or they could have face validity, which meaning that they have similar phenotypic characteristics as depression in people. So you can just kind of keep that in mind as we're talking about animal models a little bit more. And as I know you folks know, in the past, most of the models of depression have been almost entirely rodent, with a couple of key exceptions. And there's two major kinds, although some overlap between, but one are genetic models, and you can have two main branches of those that you breed for a specific trait, like Flanders sensitive or resistant lines, that sort of thing. Or you can use genetically manipulated models, so knock-ins, knockouts, knockdowns. And there are loads of those out there. And they are really good for looking at a single gene or a few genes, the role of a few genes. And so you can get pathways and novel pathways that can cue you into novel pathways. But those models aren't good for studying etiology because we created it. Behavioral stress models have been most commonly used to test pharmacotherapeutics, and pretty much all the drugs that are on the market now have been tested in behavioral stress models. In general, there are a lot of them now, but out there that have been used. But in general, the idea is to characterize behavioral and physiological responses to stress. And so there's forced swim, stress, tail suspension, helplessness, which is a shock avoidance paradigm, which isn't being used right now a whole lot, but in the past has been used a lot. Chronic mild stress, which tried to capture a little more of the reality of stress being mild in the lives of human beings often, but chronic and inescapable, and social defeat. And social defeat is the only one that is purely social stress, and I think that that's an important point when you're modeling, because we know that the brain responds differently to physical stressors than to social stressors. And so if what we're modeling are mostly social stressors, and in Western society, the kind of stress that we mostly are subject to are in fact socially related stressors, then that may be a best animal model to use. But until really recently, most of those models were also male rodents. So up until the last few years, almost the entire literature is on males, and it was thought that it just wasn't understood. We just figured that we could extrapolate from male stress responses to females. And then it began becoming clear that, once again, boys and girls are different, and maybe even females may be more stress responsive, but certainly males and females respond to different stressors. And so, one of the great things that happened in the last few years, it happened right here with Gretchen's work in taking that social defeat model and adapting it to a social situation that was relevant for females, because up until then we didn't have a social model that was relevant to female stress. But in spite of all of that, most of the data is on males, and that's the data that still drives the field. And that's true even though we know that there's a twofold difference in depression prevalence, with women being more at risk. There are sex differences in responses to stress. There's a growing literature suggesting that both efficacy and adverse effects of antidepressants are sex dependent. And none of that, of course, is really very surprising given the extent of sex differences in both function and morphology of mood-related brain regions. So another aspect when we're talking about animal modeling to keep in mind is that in our animal model studies, a lot of focus has been on the subcortical brain areas, but in human depression studies, which are largely imaging studies, although there are postmortem studies we could talk about, but mostly they point repeatedly to cortical areas as being important. And these are areas that are not well elaborated or differentiated in the rodent brain. So in fact, in the depression neural network, most of the data that we know about in subcortical regions comes from rodent models, but most of the information that we have about the cortical regions involved in the depression neural network come from human studies. And we really, that there's a chasm there that we need to be able to cross. There's also a growing concern that it may be difficult to discover novel pharmacotherapies with the current rodent models, and that's because there's been this selectivity for the monoimmune systems with rodent models of stress. Repeatedly, they point towards monoaminergic mechanisms, but the monoaminergic-based drugs are the SSRIs and SNRIs that are commonly prescribed, have full efficacy for maybe 1 in 4 depressed people, and certainly we know that about 40% or so of depressed people we have no therapy, no efficacious therapy for. So we need to go after novel pharmacotherapies. So it's with all that in mind that we started thinking about a primate model of depression. And the context here is really important because I was a postdoc in a laboratory that was primarily concerned with stress effects on cardiovascular health, so and principally on atherosclerotic coronary heart disease. And when I went there as a postdoc, honestly, I don't think I could spell the word atherosclerosis. I was a psychologist, but what I saw and what they saw, I think, was that there's a lot of common denominators. Something that I'm sure you're aware of is that depression and heart disease, for example, are highly comorbid in the human population. And so we began this long road that started a long time ago. And I started by studying social subordination stress with Jay Kaplan and Tom Clarkson and Mike Adams. And while we were watching these subordinate animals, we began seeing this behavior that I'm going to talk about. But let me remind you, I know a lot of you do monkey research, but maybe some don't. So, and I know you listen to Mark talk and his students, but what we do is a little like what they do, but has maybe some important characteristics that might be important to make sure that the data we're going to look at. So typically, we get monkeys in from the wild, actually from a purpose-bred free-ranging colony in Indonesia. And so as far as we know, they're not related, and these are adult females. So we're going to put 4 to 6 adult females in a pen, and the pen's going to be maybe 8 by 8 by 8 to 10 by 10 by 10, something like that in size. Females are about 3 kilograms in size, and so they're not big. And that's a pretty good size space for them. So if they spend time together, it's not because they're squished into a small space. It's purposeful. It's purposeful behavior. Likewise, if they stay away from each other, that too can be interpreted as purposeful behavior. When we put in those groups, they line up in linear social status hierarchies, and these are stable over a long period of time. So by linear, I mean if 1 is dominant to 2, 2 is dominant to 3, then 1 is typically dominant to 3 also in these small social groups. And these stay with these hierarchies for years on end. We've documented them as unchanging for periods of years. When we look at these animals, we think of socially supported females in this kind of grouping as being stressed because they receive more aggression. They're groupaless, and groom is one of the nicest things one monkey can do to another. It causes muscle relaxation, it reduces heart rate, and dominance are preferential. Subordinate monkeys are more vigilant. They visually scan their social environment, spend a lot of time doing that, probably to track and avoid more dominant animals. And they spend more time alone. And when I say alone, I mean out of the monkey's arm's reach of another monkey. So they're purposefully separate from each other. The other important, physiological changes, we'll talk about them in more detail later, but certainly they hypersecrete cortisol. Their adrenal glands are bigger than dominant adrenal glands, and they produce more cortisol when we challenge them with ACTH, and they have higher basal levels. And they have higher heart rate responses to a standardized stressor, and we'll look at some of that data later also. The other important point I want to make is that all the monkeys that I'm going to talk about consume, in our hands, we feed them a Western diet, a diet that is modeled after a typical American diet. This isn't monkey chow. It has more fat than monkey chow. Animal and protein, both protein and fat, come from animal sources to a large degree, although not entirely. Cholesterol content mimics what people in the U.S. eat currently, whereas monkey chow has trace cholesterol levels in it. So it's a pretty different diet, and we do that because we think that the dietary substrate that people eat is an important part of our health pattern. So we're watching these subordinate monkeys, and we kept seeing this behavior. And you can see that it includes kind of a slumped, collapsed body posture, heads lower than shoulders, eyes are open. And this monkey is not very responsive to environmental events that other monkeys pay attention to. So for example, the photographer is the same distance away from this animal as this animal. This one is watching closely because when a monkey's in a cage and a person's that close, that's a potential threat. And she is watching that potential threat very closely. Whereas this individual seems oblivious to this potential threat, this person that is so close. And so from here on, when I talk about depression in monkeys, this is what I'm talking about, is this slumped, collapsed body posture. And the metric we use to measure it typically is percent time spent in this behavior. We report it much more than other primate labs do. It is my hypothesis, which I hope to test in, is that it may be in fact due to the fact that our other big difference from other primate centers, which is that we feed a typical American diet. But we can talk more about that. The next thing that we ask is because stress precipitates depression. People we ask, and new subordinates are looked behaviorally and physiologically stressed. We ask do subordinates exhibit depressed behavior more than other animals do, and the answer is yes. About 60% of subordinates will exhibit this depressive behavior, but only maybe about 10% not all subordinates. We have non-depressed subordinates, and we do have some dominants that display this behavior. This was several years ago, and one key feature that we knew about depressed people at that time is that about half of them did not suppress cortisol production well in a dexamethasone suppression test. So to remind you what this is, we take a blood sample early in the morning and assay for cortisol, come back that night, give a little bit, a tiny dose of dexamethasone, which is a potent glucocorticoid, and come back the next morning and measure cortisol. If you have a really sensitive negative feedback loop, you're going to down-regulate cortisol production really well. If you have a less sensitive loop, then the decrease the next morning is going to be less. And sure enough, monkeys that displayed this depressive posture did not suppress as well cortisol production as their non-depressive counterparts in this dexamethasone suppression test. So it was at this point that we really started getting interested in this and thinking, maybe this might turn out to be a useful model to pursue. So we began characterizing other aspects of the health of these animals, and we wanted to look at ovarian function. These are intact cycling females that are adult to midlife that I'm talking about. People here at Yerkes are really good at this, at taking blood samples from awake monkeys, and we do this too. They run out into these, they're actually dosing cages, and stick out their leg and let us do a swab for menses and take a blood sample and treat. And so we do that for years on end, as certainly has been done at Yerkes too. And this data then represents average peak progesterone concentrations in the luteal phase in about 45 monkeys over about a 4-year period, and estradiol then in a fewer number of cycles that we assay later. And so what you can see is that, I should back up a minute and say, when I'm talking about depressed versus non-depressed, there's not any magic here. It's very arbitrary. All I did was rank order the animals by percent time spent in a depressed posture, and I cut them with the mean. And about 40% or so will fall above the mean, and 60 or so percent fall below the mean. And so when I say depressed, I mean the 40% will fall above the mean. In some of our studies, those animals, it was almost bimodal. In others, it's a little bit more continuous, but in general, it's been predictive. So that's what you're looking at here, is the 15 above the mean and against the rest. And what you can see is their luteal phase progesterone concentrations are significantly lower. And when they're lower in the luteal phase, if you back up into the follicular phase, you find that those animals with low progesterone in the luteal phase have low follicular phase estradiol, so that they are relatively estrogen deficient relative to their non-depressed counterparts. The interesting thing about this in these monkeys is that it's ovarian dysfunction with preserved menses. And so what that means for a clinical population, if this were true, we don't know, by the way, much about this in depressed women, but if it were true, depressed women and their doctors would not necessarily have any physical indication that, in fact, they had ovarian dysfunction going on. And so that's an area that's really ripe, I think, for further elucidation in clinical studies. We know quite a bit more about these animals, and I'm going to run through these characteristics fairly quickly. This is heart rate telemetered in their social group for 24 hours. They maintain, depressed animals have higher heart rates around the clock. It's actually most clear at night from 12 to 4 a.m. when they should be sleeping, and that's because the standard areas get really small, and so the mean magnitudes look really different and big. It also suggests potentially that these animals are not sleeping well, and that's something we're interested in trying to pursue. They have low activity levels, much lower activity levels than the non-depressed counterparts, and they're dyslipidemic. And here what I'm showing you is the ratio of circulating concentrations of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratios, which are higher in depressed animals. And and that's associated with depression in people. Their dyslipidemia extends to total plasma cholesterol, which is higher, and lower HDL cholesterol, which is stuff that protects you from heart disease. And so this, remember, they're all eating the same diet. It's a typical American diet. And the way we feed is that we feed in multiple sites and we feed the 10% excess to try to assure that there's equal, that subordinates get as much food as they want, basically. So it doesn't look like this is some kind of access difference here. And what I'll show you in a little bit actually is that the depressed animals are actually smaller than non-depressed, so they aren't eating more of this diet. Well, all of these are risk factors for coronary heart disease in people. And so it seemed pretty obvious that we should ask the question of whether depressed monkeys have more heart disease than non-depressed monkeys. And we looked at atherosclerosis in the coronary arteries, and these are representative sections, cross-sections of coronary artery in packs. And what we saw was really a very tight correlation between that average time spent in that depressed posture and plaque size in coronary arteries. In fact, there's about a 4-fold difference. Depressed monkeys have about 4 times the atherosclerosis in coronary arteries as their non-depressed counterparts. So what I've said so far is depressed monkeys have perturbed HPA axis, ovarian dysfunction with preserved menses, high heart rates, dyslipidemia, low activity levels, and more coronary artery atherosclerosis. So how about their neurobiology? We have done some characterization of their neurobiology. We want to do a lot more. We cannot do what needs to be done, but I'm here to tell you that we have freezers full of brains, and would very much like to outsource some of this research should any of you be interested in well-characterized, the brains from well-characterized depressed or stressed monkeys. What we have done is we started by doing a PET study, and we looked at serotonin receptor 1A binding potential. And the way we did this was we quantified depression in 36 monkeys for 2 years. And then we took the 8 most depressed and the 9 least depressed and sent them to the PET scanner. We used a ligand, a radioligand that is a 1A receptor antagonist in the regions of interest were the dorsal raphe, nucleus, amygdala, hippocampus, and cingulate. So we tried to get throughout much of the depression neural network. And we measured these bilaterally and measured distribution volume ratios, which are on the vertical axis here. So each of these are from a different neuroanatomic area. We saw no bilateral asymmetries, and so it's lumped across sides in this graph. The animals that are represented, we divided that 17 animals into tertiles. The animals in the red bars are never displayed a depressed posture. Those in the black bars would display the most, and the blue bars fell in the middle. And this is a main effect of this depressive behavior across all of these different regions. And so depressed animals just had lower serotonin 1A receptor binding in all of these regions. And even, looks sort of dose related, at least in some of these regions. And this was a representative PET scan from a depressed monkey and a non-depressed monkey. So it was easy to see the difference. We looked at the hippocampus, hippocampal volume. When we started these studies, it was becoming apparent that hippocampal volume might be different in depressed patients. At the same time, what was emerging from rodent studies, primarily mouse studies, was an appreciation for the functional differentiation along the anterior-posterior pole of the hippocampus. So the anterior part of the hippocampus processes more mood and emotional kinds of information, whereas the posterior end is more involved in memory processes. So what we did was we measured whole anterior and posterior hippocampal volume in depressed and non-depressed monkeys, and there's two studies here I'm going to tell you about side by side. And one was done post-mortem, and we sectioned through the hippocampus through the entire anterior posterior length of the hippocampus and measured with a bioseriology every 10th section. So that's why you have graduate students. And we did that in 6 depressed animals and 6 non-depressed that were these are carefully matched to their depressed counterparts on social status, body weight, basal cortisol, estradiol, and progesterone in this study, which was in intact females. And then we repeated the study, but did it using MRI. And in those animals were ovariac mice. So on the left is the postmortem study. And what you can see is there wasn't a significant difference between depressed and non-depressed in whole hippocampal volumes. But when we divided at the level of the uncus, the hippocampus into anterior and posterior, we found that anterior hippocampi were smaller in these depressed females. In the follow-up, in our next study in ovariectomized females, first off, the MRI, so we have left and right now, and we did, again, we saw no bilateral asymmetries, and so no differences there. But what we did see is that in ovariectomized females, the whole hippocampus was smaller in these depressed animals. And when we again divided into anterior and posterior, we saw that this that the posterior was as affected, was smaller than in the depressed monkeys that was as affected really as the anterior. So that's really interesting because what it brings up the hypothesis potentially that even suboptimal ovarian function, remember they got suppressed ovarian function, but they got some. They got estradiol and progesterone more. They are having menses, it's just not as good as their non-depressed counterparts. Even that suboptimal ovarian function may be exerting a protective effect, at least in the posterior hippocampus. So that is an observation that we also would like to pursue. This is a new study now, and Stephanie Willard in my lab did this study, and this is the study I just showed you. And this is 8. This is from a completely new study, completely new set of animals. She took 8 depressed animals, matched again on all those characteristics to 8 non-depressed animals, and I think the answer is no. What was really, Stephanie was so tickled because she completely replicated her first study in the second study and using a different postmortem methodology. But not only did she replicate the effect, but I think what is really good to see is that the size of the hippocampi as well as the difference between the two were remarkably similar. So that's good because she went on to measure a lot of other things in this particular study. Yes?
Were they intact as well?
Intacts. These are intacts. So, yep, and from here I've only got one OVF study, which I'd like to fix that one of these days soon. So these are going to be intact females, and again, we saw no effects at all in the posterior hippocampus, so I'm not going to talk about it at all. What Stephanie did was she counted and measured the size of glia and neuron and neuropil, and she did it in every 10th section throughout the anterior posterior pole. She looked at separately at CA1, CVIC1, CA2, and distant CA3, proximal CA3, and the rotate gyrus. And I'm going to summarize all of that amazing amount of work in a very short summary here because I want to get to some other things, but you'll see this in literature soon. Their manuscripts are out there, and hopefully will be in the literature available soon. But probably some of the most interesting findings really were, first off, they were almost entirely in the CA1 curriculum. And she saw, first off, reduced numbers of glia and reduced neuropil in the CA1. There were a few less neurons, but it wasn't a significant difference, and so this was really a glial event going on in these monkeys. And whether that's a rodent primate difference or a diet difference or a female-male difference are all reasonable questions that are still need to be addressed. She looked at gene and protein expression, and the most remarkable findings were a decrease in spinal fluid and PSD95, suggesting that the postsynaptic integrity was compromised. And this is similar, this is seen in female rodent stress models, but not in male rodent stress models. That in particular seems to be a sex difference. She also found increased GFAP, and that's really interesting. It suggests potential for glutamatergic transmission. Also, it suggests the potential that this impaired synaptic plasticity that's inferred here may be astrocyte mediated. And we're really interested in it because estradiol reduces GFAP and it mediates astrocyte function, particularly in regards to glutamate, glutamine, and MTA. So that is an area that we're hoping to go in and look more carefully because it may be particular to female depression. And what I think is most interesting about that is that it may be that the reduced ovarian steroids that are being produced in these animals alter the effects of estrogen in the brain. And that's where we'd like to go with that. So what I said about neurobiology is that these monkeys that act like that have reduced serotonin 1A receptor binding throughout many areas of the depression neural network. They have smaller hippocampy, and this is in the context of impaired ovarian function with preserved menses. So we've only begun to dabble in therapeutics, and this is our first trial. And the idea here, they've got more heart disease and they've got more depression, and there's been an interest in whether or not depression causes heart disease causes depression, or whether it's two diseases that have common etiology but are epiphenomenon, that in fact they're comorbid, highly comorbid is an epiphenomenon. And so we thought this would be a good model to address some of those questions. So very briefly, and these data aren't out yet, we're just analyzing them now. This represents 42 monkeys, adult females intact, small social groups, some baseline data. They started eating a typical American diet. We keep track of behavior, ovarian function, and some other phenotypic characteristics. And then after 18 months, they were assigned to one of two treatment groups, either sertraline, Zoloft, or placebo. And these were balanced on pretreatment depression and body weight. So that means that in the placebo group, there's depressed and non-depressed, and in the sertraline group, there's depressed and non-depressed. And then we looked at atherosclerosis at the end in the coronary arteries. So there's three things I think I can say pretty clearly about the outcomes that we understand so far in this study. And one is that Zoloft doesn't work very well at all for depressive behavior in female cynomolgus monkeys. And that part looks really clear. And maybe I'm not surprised we were not powered for efficacy for depression because it's such a small treatment effect in the human population. We would have needed far too more monkeys than we could possibly afford. So there's a message in there. However, it's a great drug for anxiety, and that was very interesting to us. And there was no effect at all of Zoloft on coronary artery atherosclerosis extent, and no modification of the depression-atherosclerosis relationship. So the still have about 4 times the atherosclerosis of their non-depressed counterparts. So that is something we'll have to keep after via other mechanisms. So what I said, I think this is everything I've said in one slide. And what I said, we started with social subordination. We said we think female subordinates are stressed because they receive more aggression, they work less, they're more vigilant, they spend more time alone, they have hypersecrete cortisol, higher skin heart rates, they're more likely to exhibit behavioral depression. When they do, they're going to have smaller hippocampy, reduced serotonin 1A receptor binding, and more extensive coronary artery atherosclerosis. And we hope to follow up on some of these observations and get into some novel therapeutics in the future. So now to the question that I really wanted to pose, which is this idea of whether stress and depression are different or whether they're the same. And the reason that's really important is because predominantly our animal models are stress models and have been, and they have covered the whole field and the direction it has gone. But if stress is different than depression, maybe we need to be better about discriminating between those two constructs in our animal models. So what I'm going to do really is just compare and contrast really quickly differences between subordinate and dominant and differences between depressed and non-depressed. From here on up. So I'm going to run through a bunch of phenotypic characteristics, some from our labs, some from labs here, and some from other labs. So what I can tell you is that we report no social status differences in body weight or body mass index, but remember we feed how we feed in a particular way that really suppresses the competition between dominance and subordinates, at least feeding competition. Whereas depressed monkeys have lower body weight and lower body mass index compared to their non-depressed counterparts. Subordinates are hypercortisolemic at baseline and after dexamethasone, whereas in depressed monkeys what we see is an insensitivity to glucocorticoid negative feedback. In subordinate animals have larger adrenal glands than dominants do. We don't know, we actually haven't measured the adrenal gland size in depressed versus non-depressed. It's something we ought to do. Subordinate adrenal glands hypersecrete cortisol in response to an ACTH challenge test relative to their dominant counterparts. There's no difference between depressed and non-depressed in response to ACTH. We do know in depressed monkeys that they have a lower cortisol response to a CRH challenge, but that there's no reports in the literature about dominants versus subordinates that I know of. Maybe you have it, don't you? No, you can tell. You can talk about that. Heart rate, autonomic function to the extent that it's a reflection of autonomic function. When we subordinates, when we take them out of their social groups and put them in a strange environment, in a group challenge, subordinates have higher heart rate responses and they don't recover as much or as fast as dominant animals. That's not what we see in depressed versus non-depressed. In depressed monkeys, we see 24-hour increases in heart rate, so it's around the clock, and we do not see that in subordinate monkeys. Ovarian function appears to be suppressed in similar ways in both depressed monkeys and in socially subordinate monkeys. So what I just said was that there are differences in body weight and body mass index. In our case, we have Mark's been filling this box for me, and but we have at least some differences in HPA axis, but whether or not they're really true differences, I think we need more study. They both have perturbed autonomic function and ovarian function. Maybe it's more severe in depressed animals. In terms of neurobiology, what's been reported is in the differences between dominants and subordinates are really receptor binding in the striatum, so it's lower in subordinate animals. And that's mirrored by differences in CSF HPA, a major metabolite of dopamine. No differences in with 1A receptor binding in PET studies, and no differences have been reported in hippocampal body. We haven't seen them. It may be that the jury's still out on that. Those sample sizes are, after all, fairly small. Whereas, as you've seen already, the depressed animals have this difference in serotonin and in hippocampal body. Probably the biggest differences that we see really are in behavior, and these are social behaviors that have been observed in these animals' home groups over long. So this is chronic behavior patterns observed for years, typically. And both subordinates and depressed animals are less aggressive. Subordinates receive more aggression, depressed animals don't. So the other animals in the group don't pick on depressed animals. Subordinates are more submissive. Depressed animals are actually have lower rates of submissive behavior than non-depressed animals. Submissions received, it's lower in subordinates, no difference in depression. Vigilant scanning, subordinates or vigilant depressed are either significantly less in one study or equivalent in terms of visual scanning of their environment. Subordinates are groomed less than dominant animals. There's no difference in depressed versus non-depressed. Body contact, no difference in subordinates. Depressed animals actually spend more time in body contact than non-depressed animals, which is a really interesting behavioral trait, I think, that we could talk more about later if you wanted. Subordinate monkeys spend more time alone. Depressed monkeys don't spend more time alone, actually, because they're doing this body contact thing. Activity levels, no difference between dominant and subordinates. Depressed have very low activity levels relative to their non-depressed counterparts. They're dyslipidemic, as we already saw. Dominant and subordinate animals don't seem to differ very much in lipid metabolism. There was one report in 1983, and there's been one report in male baboons in East Africa. So not very much of a difference, far more notable in depressed animals. And subordinate animals do get more atherosclerosis than dominant animals. It's about a twofold difference, and this is a compilation of a number of studies now, whereas we see about a fourfold difference in depressed versus non-depressed animals in atherosclerosis extent. Mortality, subordinates experience greater mortality than dominants, and depressed